Okay, so yes, this is in fact a cover illustration. I also have it behind me by the artist Sharon Kivland, who is like me fascinated by the French Republican or Revolutionary calendar of 1793, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, and okay, so no, it's not actually in the right place. Okay, great. So I'm going to start off just by returning to these reflections on the term avant-garde, so simply the word for it, with this with this comment here. It is we, artists, who will serve as your avant-garde. The power of the arts is indeed the most immediate and the fastest. We have weapons of all kinds. When we want to spread new ideas among men, we inscribe them on marble or on canvas. And so this is from Claude Henri de Saint-Simon from 1825, and one of the earlier uses of this term, possibly the earliest. And it's a term that's very problematic, as we've discussed in several ways, particularly in its military connotations, but also here, I think, in its instrumentalism, where marble and canvas are simply vehicles for ideas and not materials that might give shape to them through sensory or embodied understanding. And it does suggest an idea of revolutionary progress, in Saint-Simon's case, towards a scientific and industrialized future. And the avant-garde, as we've said, is always in some sense a question about time and advance or an early arrival. But the word also carries this territorial aspect. It's moving forward on a battlefield. And what do we do with this now, where the future has come up against the limits of place, the finite edges of a planet and its diminishing resources? So Saint-Simon was shaped by the French Revolution, though his relationship to it is a bit too complex to describe here. So he spent part of it profiteering and another part of it in prison. But I want to dwell on the word revolution and its implications of both circularity and change. So it does something different with place, with the planetary space we share with others. And I want to comment too on the Canadian poet Stephen Collis, who uses the term biotariat to describe that portion of existence that is enclosed as a resource by and for those who direct and benefit from the accumulation of wealth. And he says it encompasses workers and commoners, most animals and plants, including trees and forest and grassland ecosystems, water, land as it provisions and enables biological life, minerals that lie beneath the surface of the land, common wastes and sinks too, into which the waste products of resource production and use are spilled, the atmosphere and the oceans. It's that large. So in this context, I want to think about the interplay between language, the senses, and the non-human in my practice as a poet. And a revolutionary calendar, this collection of poems, is a sequence of 360 poems. They're 5 lines each, and they're based on the plants, animals, and agricultural implements to which each day was dedicated in the French Republican calendar. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but I'll, oh, am I going, there we go. I will just read a couple of poems to start off, because so today is the 12th day of Frimaire in the year of the Republic, 231, and celebrating cedar. Tomorrow is fir, and these are the poems that I've written in dedication to those dedications. So cedre, cedar. The scent of a box opens on the forest in your limbs. It branches through today's low sun citrine buzz. Sapin, fir. We come to our senses in the needling underfoot, a skin of resins, this force to which we come among forces. So the calendar was an attempt to break the hierarchical power of the church by restructuring time according to the principles of nature and reason. And it was used from 1793 to 1805 and subsequently revived for 18 days in 1871 during the Paris Commune. And its aim was to recenter time on the agricultural worker. So the months were renamed seasonally. So as I've mentioned, we're in the month of Frimaire or frost. And each one was organized into 3 10-day décades in which days were given numerical names from primidi to décadi. And instead of being dedicated to saints in the church year, each day was also a feast day in a new secular scheme where each 5th day was named after a domestic animal or a wild one that's eaten, and each 10th day after an agricultural implement. In all but one of the months, the remaining days were named after trees, flowers, and plants. So Fabre d'Eglantine is the name that's most closely associated with the construction of the calendar. And it was he who came up with the names of the months. However, the detailed listing of plants for each of the days relied on the knowledge of André Thuin, who was the head gardener at the Jardin des Plantes. Okay, so here we are. And just flick on another one. So here you can see some of the listing of the plants. And so I'm reading the calendar itself as an avant-garde text, an experimental collaboration between writer and horticulturalist, and this attempt really to remake time through this really fascinating text. And the rationale was that this abstraction of the church's regime would be replaced by a more direct experience of the natural world, with the intention of recognizing agriculture as the foundation of human existence. And Fabre d'Eglantine, in presenting his plan to the National Convention, argued its purpose like this: when at each instant of the year, of the month, the decade, and the day, the thoughts of the citizen shall be directed towards an agricultural image, towards the benefit of nature, or towards an object of the rural economy. You cannot doubt, since for ages the people have nourished an affection for fantastic objects, for pretended saints they did not see, and whom they knew still less. You cannot doubt, I say, but that it will lead the nation a great way towards the agricultural system, and that each citizen will conceive an equal affection for the real and effectual gifts of nature he enjoys. So d'Eglantine was influenced by thinkers such as Etienne Bonneau de Condillac, the French philosopher who, following John Locke, argued that all knowledge stems from sensory experience. And in the light of such theories, d'Eglantine believed, as Sanja Perovic notes, that a new collective memory could be constructed ex nihilo and quickly through an effective immersion in images. So time was given symbolic shape within reach of the senses. So the result is a calendar that has resonances with conceptualizations of time from other parts of the world and periods of history. For example, the Aztec calendar has days named after plants and animals. The Republican calendar begins on the 21st of September, so it's also close to the Jewish New Year. Its 10-day week recalls the ancient Egyptian structure. And so this evocation of past systems elsewhere is paradoxical given its context within a new decimal system based on reason, a progressive, rational break with the past. And Perovic comments on the double-sided aspect of time, that turns both to the cyclical past and to a linear path forward. And she asks, how did a revolution that first staged itself as regeneration, that is, as a restoration of a better past, come to think of itself under the symbol of rupture? In other words, how did a revolution that had turned to a new calendar in order to reintegrate history into the natural and cyclical time of the planetary revolutions come to define itself as an irreversible and linear change? And what was the process by which these many ostensibly natural revolutions came to be reduced to the one revolution that now moved in the linear and homogeneous time of history? So Perovic's observations are relevant for the current ecological crisis, in which fear of apocalypse leads either to paralysis or a faith in the redemptive power of technological solutions. The calendar's temporalities are all the more intriguing, given that it collides with the Industrial Revolution, a defining point for the Anthropocene. The only month that is not full of olfactory suggestiveness is Nivose, which lists rocks and minerals instead. So that comes up sort of into late January. So I'm going to just read a poem from that month. Turb, peat. Bogged down in what you might need to know for tomorrow, but don't, at least not yet, you toast the coming day in phenols, soak up the flood as life under pressure, grass, moss, lichen, mice, roots, human compacted. So in layering places and times, I've allowed my own sensory associations, in this case with whiskey, to collide with the calendar as a historical document. Geological time underlies the seasonal rotations of vegetable life in the other months, and the temporality of earth is also evident to the senses, whether in the tactile qualities of slate, sandstone, or flint. So in the current moment of an emergency, the coincidence of time and weather being the same words in French, temps, seems inevitable in any language. And a sedimentary underground thinking reveals time as extraction. What was once a speeding up of transport and industry enabled by minerals is now a rush towards deeper and deeper climate emergency. So in relation to this, I'm thinking of Donna Haraway and her term Cthulhucene, her comments on time here. And in Staying with the Trouble, she comments on on this term Cthulhucene as a compound of two Greek roots, chthon and kainos, that together name a kind of time place, or learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth. Nothing in kainos must mean conventional pasts, presents, or futures. There is nothing in times of beginning that insists on wiping out what has come before, or indeed wiping out what comes after. I hear kainos in the sense of thick, ongoing presence, with hyphae infusing all sorts of temporalities and materialities. So in responding to the calendar, I wanted to mark time. So Haraway's using this sort of fungal idea of hyphae here, this infusion of temporalities. And I was thinking of the way that time moves through language. And so every month that I've written has its own punctuation mark. So apart from the first one, which just has spaces. So for Nivose, the ellipsis was suggested by the geological layer of human impact. But also the idea of poetry is a different experience of time and duration, or a form of pausing that in a political system that's predicated on expansion is a form of resistance. So poetry makes time sensory, and it draws attention to the sensuality of language that is noticed by Marx, who says the element of thought itself, the element of thought's living expression, language, is of a sensuous nature. And as the late British poet Sean Bonney has observed, Rimbaud's famous reference to the dérèglement de tous les sens, or the derangement of all the senses, like his statement, I is another, should be understood in the context of the 1871 Paris Commune as a comment on the destruction of bourgeois subjectivity. The senses are at the heart of the revolutionary modernisms of the 20th century, a breaking of forms that allows materials, including the materiality of language, to be felt and experienced in order to make new worlds out of a new word order. So Dadaist Tristan Tzara invites us to take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, make poetry out of chaotic disordering, but systematic reordering can equally be a way of breaking a pattern. The mathematical limits of calendrical thinking function as a constraint, in the sense, for example, of the Oulipo, whose Sarah has already mentioned, the Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, as do the arbitrary lists of plants and objects organized around use rather than ownership. So Marx observes that in the place of all physical and mental senses, there has therefore come the sheer estrangement of all these senses, the sense of having. Private ownership overrides and diminishes the other senses. In the relentless pursuit of capital, the senses are degraded and can only be emancipated through a shift away from private property to the commons of public ownership. Furthermore, Marx makes the point that the senses are both social and constructed. The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. And while he asserts a singular masculine humanist sensibility, Marx's materialism locates the human body within a history of interactions that includes all other human bodies and a formation of senses in response to the non-human external world. The calendar is arranged around human use, whether of plants or objects, and it makes a fascinating record of taste formation. So curiosities such as skirit and two different kinds of salsify make an appearance in a late autumn that would have involved a very cold and muddy scrabbling for roots, which were then familiar for centuries, but which are now unknown, while potatoes and tomatoes are among the plants listed that reflect the roots of European colonialism. So the senses, recognized as mutable rather than innate, connect humans with everything around them. And it's this outward movement that I've pursued in thinking of the calendar as a document of human agriculture that foregrounds the presence of the more than human. The reawakening of the senses must include others, not just the other human being that Marx recognizes as the greatest wealth, but a commons that makes room for the non-extractive relationships with other entities. So the calendar also led me to a sense of the body as it's produced by non-human agents. So herbivores and omnivores in particular distinguish between the precise tastes of plants and need to do so in order to avoid being poisons. And in response, plants have evolved certain tastes and smells to facilitate seed dispersal. So the mouths and tastes of many creatures have evolved in conjunction with plants. And so we might think of an agency that goes beyond the human, that is around us, also inside us, as Jane Bennett points out. She says a swarm of non-humans are at work inside and as us. We are powered by a host of inner aliens, including ingested plants, animals, pharmaceuticals, and the microbiomes on which thinking itself relies. And so just sort of thinking of the active agency of the non-human, we might also think of the movements that are suggested in the calendar in relation to names and the naming of plants. And so some of the poems trace the journey of plant migrations, as for example, the first day of the sequence for Brachial, which is dedicated to Luzerne or Alfalfa. A field of vision bleeding at the edge rolls through the season, purple medic from the meads or alfasfasa from elsewhere turning on the tongue. It grows, you cut it back. A nation is this haze. So the Iranian and Arabic histories of this plant reveal that there's no originating point for either a plant or a name. Language and plants alike are glimpsed momentarily in the course of long migrations. The organizing effort of the calendar is doomed to failure, since time cannot be fixed in linguistic or spatial containers. The seasonal months only apply to part of France, not even the whole country. My inhabiting of this French calendar anachronistically and in another country is critical, depending on the gap between between sensory experience and abstractions such as nation, since neither the languages nor the plants will stay put. Etymologies wander across borders, sense associations, far from creating a unified collective memory, as d'Eglantine hoped, proliferate in multiple directions. I might return to a revolutionary past in order to imagine a future, but it's a past entangled with other dimensions. And as Donna Haraway suggests, a relationship with our mixed up times might be seen more helpfully in terms of tentacular thinking that might enable us to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick presence. So I'll just finish with a few brief observations about sort of the life since of these poems since the book came out in 2020. And so some of this was through performance, sort of during lockdown, walking in Treborth Botanic Gardens, and some of this is documented as part of the Metamorphosis festival that Sarah and others were organizing, and so you can see it there. Also, I've worked a bit on performance with sound. First of all, in fact, for Languages of Virus, hosted by Felipe Cusson, who's going to talk to us next, and so that the recording of that performance and conversation is online, and then most recently, this is just last month in Montreal, and so what I was doing here was actually taking the fruit and vegetables from the month of Vendémiaire and making a sound performance out of them. So I collected, or in fact my collaborator in Montreal collected very kindly a whole selection of grapes, carrots, potatoes, squash, pumpkin, peppers, sunflowers, and I gathered them all together, and I made as much sound out of them as I could while reading poems. So I was chopping and chewing and slurping and singing and actually playing with those the sounds of sociality, but those that we usually try to minimize perhaps as sound sources. So you're not supposed to crunch noisily, but that's what I was making the sort of sound background out of, and using an electronic looper to make these textures around the poems. And so this remains something that I'm interested in, sort of extending a kind of sociality to the materials of the calendar. And if the calendar was historically a project that put the senses to work for quite defined political ends, it also suggests a line of thinking that invites us now to come to our senses against the rush of digital misinformation and manipulation, the visual saturation of consciousness by invisible forces, It asserts the need for collective understanding of the ways in which bodies are connected with the material world that sustains them, and for collective ownership of an imagination drawn from those relationships. So the senses locate the body in its time and in the eating and breathing that makes one body part of every other. Thank you very much.